Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our office today, to our press conference. Thank you for joining us. My name is Soona Samsami. I am representing the NCRI US. And today I will start with some comments about the recent uprising in Iran. And then my colleague, Mr. Alireza Jafarzadeh, will continue on the some question and answer and presentation with PowerPoint. The Iranian people nationwide uprising, which engulfed 170 cities with 450 martyrs, 4,000 wounded, and 10,000 arrested, is a turning point toward the overthrow of ruling theocracy in Iran. From the outset, the regime's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, described the protesters as bandits and personally ordered their suppression. Today, we are publishing this report. Iran Uprising, and the information on this report has been just updated. We had the number of protesters that killed by the agents of the Iranian regime last night was 127. This morning turned to the names that we have, turned to 154 names. And so we have the names available. We can provide it to the media if they want to. If the regime in Iran considers rising up and rebellion to bring down it and establish freedom and democracy and equality as sedition and insecurity, the defiant youth, the resistance units, the Mujahideen Khalq, and all freedom fighters are proud to do that. In the past year, resistance units kept the flames of uprising alight across the country and set the stage for this uprising despite so many pressures and surveillances by the IRGC and the Intelligence Ministry of Iran regime. The rebellious cities have encircled the mullah's fragile and moribund regime and have shaken the ground under mullah's feet. What has happened since 2017 shows that the uprising cannot be distinguished. The regime is incapable of containing the uprising and the rebellious cities and resistance units. The army of the unemployed, the poor people, the hungry people, the women, the oppressed will not rest nor surrender. They are determined to overthrow this ruthless regime. During the uprising, the people of Shiraz, Shahryar, Fardis, Kermanshah, Ahvaz, and so many other cities all over Iran stood up. The time to free all of Iran from the mullah's occupation and shackles have arrived. The mullah's regime is facing an impasse and the crisis to be overthrown. It has found the only recourse in suppression and killings. But at the end of their rule, dictators get the opposite result from their policies. By ordering the ruthless killings of the protesters, Khamenei has expedited the process of its regime being overthrown. Rouhani put aside all of his moderate comments, the election time moderate posturing, and called for the suppression of the youth in Iran and the people who were uprising. This is the common tactic of the Khamenei, Rouhani, and other regimes' leaders. They all sitting together in a sinking ship. The regime, which cannot abandon the export of terrorism, warmongering, nuclear and missile project, resorted to more aggression against ships and oil installations in the region to confront the sanctions. And inside Iran, it made theft and plunder of the people's wealth officially, by increasing the price of fuel, the regime wants to impose greater poverty and inflation on the citizens so that it can secure the cost of suppression from the pockets of the poorest sectors of the Iranian society. But massive profits and billion-dollar embezzlements, which are the primary cause of the country's economy, have remained untouched. Just as Rouhani acts shoulder to shoulder with Khamenei in suppressing the people of Iran, he is also an accomplice in stealing the people's money and exerting dual pressure on them. Here I'd like to comment on some of the points that Mrs. Rajavi have mentioned. Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of National Council of Resistance of Iran, has stated, 1, the crimes carried out by the Iranian regime against our people are by any measure crimes against humanity. World governments and the international community must set aside all considerations and reservations about the Iranian regime. They should demand an immediate halt to the killing and arrests. If the regime does not comply, they must readily pull the trigger of UN Security Council sanctions. 2, the UN Security Council must declare the leaders of Iranian regime as criminals committing crimes against humanity. They must face justice for the massive bloodshed and massive suppression in Iran. 3, the international community must also strongly condemn the mullahs' internet terrorism and insist the people of Iran in circumventing this inhuman blockade. Number 4, the clerical regime is making every effort and using all means to conceal the actual number of the martyrs and those killed in the country. The United Nations must immediately dispatch a fact-finding mission to Iran to investigate the number of those killed, injured, and imprisoned currently. Thank you very much, and I'd like to ask my colleague, Mr. Jafarzadeh, to come and continue. Once again, this is the report we had today. Publish it, and it's available. You can pick up front. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. We'd like to show you a video clip of the uprising first before I proceed with my remarks. Could we show that, please?
مرگ بر خامنه‌ای! مرگ بر خامنه‌ای!
با موتور به مردم حمله کردن. خانوما بگیرین همینا بگیرین
یه دونه شیشه ماشین یا پنجره رو نشکستن، با کتک جواب دادن. خامنه ای بی ناموس، خامنه ای دادگاهیت میکنیم، ما حق قانونیمون اعتراض کنیم.
My name is Reza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And again, welcome to our press conference in our Washington office. What I would like to elaborate today, first in terms of the numbers and the figures that we have been able to compile from inside Iran, as there's a team working minute by minute, updating the information that we have about the situation there. The latest figures we have is that the protests have engulfed all 31 provinces of Iran. It has expanded to 176 cities across the country, and based on our latest estimate, over 450 people have been killed. Over 4,000 have been arrested, and 4,000 have been injured, and over 10,000 have been arrested. We have identified the names of at least 154 of those who have been killed, and the list is constantly being updated. Now, the slogans, you heard some of it on the video, is targeted against the entirety of this regime, from Khamenei to Rouhani to the entire dictatorship ruling the Velayat Faqih system. They're saying that our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America. And there's so many other slogans. We have the details in the report. This is a map of various cities across the country who've been impacted by that. You can see how widespread it is. It's not limited to a certain region or part of the country. It shows that the grievances is national against the regime, and people from all walks of life want an end to the rule of the dictatorship in Iran. The cities that had the biggest confrontations, we've listed them from Shiraz, which some of the major confrontations that between the suppressive forces and the people took place there, to Mashhad, where a lot of those protests originally started in Khuzestan province, Behbahan, Isfahan, and Kermanshah. Over roughly about 40 people we have identified killed just in the province of Kermanshah, in Karaj near Tehran, in Islamshahar, in Mariban in the Kurdish region, Shahryar, and all of the other cities. These are some of the names that we've been able to identify, as you can see here. But of course, the list has been updated since last night that we prepared this report, and we are more than happy to provide you with the updated list later on. What's important is that what is it that the people were actually doing during the protests? In addition to protesting against the entirety of the regime, they feel that unless they actually target the centers of the regime, the symbols of the regime, that that are symbols of suppression and also corruption. The wealth of a nation, a very rich nation. Iran has the second largest oil and gas reserves combined in the world, and yet the vast majority of the population live below the poverty line. Where's the money? It's in the hands of the IRGC and the Khamenei and his affiliates. So those places were targeted. Anything affiliated with the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, and Khamenei, the centers of Basij, which is in charge of domestic repression in different parts. Office of the mullahs associated with Khamenei were impacted. All the government buildings, banks, gas stations, these are all government owned. It's not like here. Gas stations are not private. They're run by the regime, and that's where the money goes to benefit the Ayatollahs. And the chain stores linked to the IRGC were the ones who were mostly affected. And the situation was so serious as far as the regime was concerned. This is the head of the ideological political organization of the repressive forces. He said that the incidents of the recent days in the country were more complicated than those which occurred in 1999, 2009, and 2018. And then in one day alone, unrest erupted in 165 cities of 25 provinces. The recent sedition caused insecurity in 900 locations. This is confession by the Iran regime's officials. Of course, they always tend to downplay the numbers, but they had to confess that in one day, 165 cities were engulfed in the protests, showing how widespread the hatred of the population is against the regime in its entirety. This is the commander of the operations of the Basij, the notorious Basij force, Salar Abnoush, who said that there was an all-out war against the state and the revolution. He said the strange and incredible coordination in the current sedition was formed, and they were only waiting for a spark to destroy the country. Additional information will be provided after extracting confessions, meaning torture. And as a field person, I believe God was our savior, thinking that he's even surprised how come the mullahs weren't surprised. That's how serious the situation has been and continues to be. And we have some of the intercept wireless communications that among the different officials of the suppressive forces. This one is between the Brigadier General Hossein Rahimi, who is the head of the security zone of Greater Tehran, and he is getting a message from one of the commanders who is saying that the situation is red, and the protesters head towards the governor's office. There are around 5,000 people. If Bashir comes late, Bashir is a code for forces on the ground, the governorate will fall. And Rahimi says, okay, coordination was undertaken so that IRGC would come to your help from their garrison out there. Now, the reason this is important is that within the Iranian regime, the situations are classified based on like normal, which they call it white. The second one is abnormal state, which is gray, extraordinary state, which is yellow, and then critical state, which is red. Now, on the 15, based on the information that the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, the main Iranian opposition movement obtained from within the regime, at 2 p.m. on Monday, November 15, the state security forces declared a state of red alert. And at that time, they handed over all of the issues relating to the security matters to the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC. In other words, the state security forces were put directly under the control and orders by the IRGC to contain the situation. It makes it very clear that, first of all, the state security forces, whose mission is to suppress the population, were unable to control the situation starting on the November 15th, and the regime felt it was a critical danger, critical state, or what they call the red alert. So that's just like one clear indication of what the situation was. There was also another communication also indicates that the situation was treated as very critical by the Iran regime, and they felt that they had to resort to the level of violence as you saw in the video. Otherwise, the game would be over for them once and for all. This is another communication. This police command center is saying, my friend, please note, Rahavar base, which is the police base in Sabah Shahr, which is a suburb of Shahryar. Shahryar is also near Tehran, has been overrun by protesters, and Basij base of Mira has also been overrun, and they use a code. They are now moving towards Sabah Shahr. So this is a state of chaos as far as the regime was concerned. They couldn't really control the situation. The state-run daily reported that only 3 days damage was worth an equivalent of at least 7.5% of the annual proceedings from gas price hikes were inflicted. This is their own assessment of the situation, and they said that 180 gas stations, 450 banks, and in just 4 cities out of the 76 cities, and 80 branches of IRGC-affiliated chain stores were damaged. These are numbers put out by the regime itself. Etemad state-run paper said that just in Shiraz, the youth had set fire to 76 banks, and in 4 days, $1.5 billion of damage were inflicted on the regime's wealth, obviously, not the nation's economy. The economy is controlled by the IRGC. Now, what's so significant about the banks? First of all, we have a chart back there that lists all the 31 banks in Iran, and it shows the affiliation of those banks, that how all of them are controlled by one branch or the other branch of the regime, whether it's the IRGC, whether it's Mosazzafan Foundation, and all of that. And take a look at this picture. This is the Sina Bank that was put on fire by the people. Who owns Sina Bank is Mosazzafan Foundation, which is entirely controlled by Khamenei. He actually appoints the head of the Mosazzafan Foundation. The money goes to Khamenei. This is Bank Milli, the largest bank of Iran with over 3,000 branches, which is, by the way, designated by the Treasury Department as SDGT, especially designated global terrorist, that was set on fire. And so many of those branches were set on fire because people see them, the elements of corruption. This is Bank Millat, another one with about 1,600 branches, also designated as SDGT by the Treasury Department, is actually owned by Khamenei's Setad. Setad is an entity that has more than $95 billion of assets basically confiscated from the people and brought under the control of Khamenei, and they own this bank. So that explains why the Iranian people were targeting these institutions and nothing else. This is Pasargad Bank with about 350 branches, sanctions by the Treasury, is actually largely owned by the IRGC. This is a police station that was burned by the people. Another government building burned in the city of Karaj, which was the scene of a lot of confrontations between the people and the regime's repressive forces. Now, the level of suppression, some of which you saw in the video, this is a quotation from Ahmad Khatami. He's a Friday prayer leader of Tehran. Every time there is a crisis, anything major, he shows up at the Friday prayer and echoes the views and the positions of regime Supreme Leader Khamenei. He says, in view of the extensive plot that these people designed, we must seek and pursue them from house to house and turn them to the officials. That's the level of fear among the regime, that they have to go house to house against the people. He says judicial officials must hand down the ultimate punishment to the organizers and the leaders. They are muharib. Muharib meaning waging war against God. And of course, because the regime considers itself as a representative of God, any opposition to the regime is considered as waging war against God and therefore punishable by death. This is the state-run Kayhan, headed by Shariat Madari, and Kayhan is basically the mouthpiece of Khamenei. And he says some of the reports indicate that judicial officials are certain that punishments by the noose will be delivered to the leaders of the recent riots. Now, this is Faiza Hashemi, the daughter of Rafsanjani, who was a close ally of Rouhani. Even she is saying, Mr. Rouhani, if the number of protesters is so low, because Rouhani said there were only a few people, why have you shut down the internet? What's the reason for such treatment? So this is Hessamuddin Ashena. He's an advisor to Rouhani on mostly security matters. He basically described what happened in those days of the uprising as the Operation Eternal Light No. 2, referring to the major operation by the Mujahideen Khal, the MEK, that in 1988 went advanced 170 kilometers into the country, to the gates of Kermanshah. And then he promised killings similar to the summer of 1988 massacre of political prisoners. You know, so you can see how Rouhani and Khamenei, all of the factions, are focused in containing the protests and suppressing them. This is the same guy, Hessamuddin Ashena, that in a tweet only 10 days before the July 2018 plot by the regime to wage a terror plot in a major gathering of the movement, the Iranian resistance movement, where Mrs. Rajiv and others were there, 100,000 people were there. In a tweet, he basically said that's what is expected just 10 days before that. So he knows all of the details. He's on top of the details about the terrorism of the Iran regime, as well as the suppression of what's happening there. Now, these are, we have identified 87 of key officials who were involved in the suppression and the killings on the scene in various provinces, mostly focusing on the major provinces where the protests took place. These are the judiciary officials that we've listed here. We have all the names and details in the report that we submitted to you, from Ahmad Khatami to the others. And then this is in Tehran province, the IRGC Greater Tehran, from officials from Muhammad Rasulullah Corps, which was in charge of suppressing the dissent in a major portion of Tehran. And this is another one from the Sayyid al-Shuhada Corps, the commanders of the IRGC. Again, as I said, the protection of the cities were handed over from state security forces to the IRGC, and we feel it's so important to identify these IRGC commanders and the institutions who are behind the repression. This is in Kurdistan province that a lot of killings took place there. They were shooting directly at the peaceful and unarmed demonstrators. In Khuzestan province, where the protests were triggered initially, and also Kermanshah province. You can see all the names of the people involved. And Fars province, Shiraz and other cities, which were scenes of major protests for days and days and days. Esfahan province, another place with major protests, Alborz province, and so on. These protests certainly were not, didn't happen by themselves. There were people who had paved the way over the years, people who had called the organized resistance, the Mujahideen Khalq, who had called for the overthrow of this regime at the time that people were pinning hopes on Khatami, thinking that Khatami or the so-called reformers are going to bring about change in Iran. The position of the resistance was that there's only one solution, one way forward, and it's the overthrow of the regime. So it's important to take a look at some of the positions taken by the regime on the role of the MEK in the protest. This is Hossein Ashtari, the commander of the state security forces, saying that investigation shows that behind the scenes, anti-revolution organizations and the MEK led these movements. This is the Jamhuri Islami state-run newspaper saying that, quoting the commander of the Fajr garrison, that the leaders of the riots had ties to the MEK. This is Vatana Imruz Daily saying that the methods employed by the core units of the recent incidents showed that these individuals were completely trained and these individuals were ready for such circumstances. Jamhuri Islami on November 20th saying that the scale of the destruction was so vast that actions were so professionally carried out that it directed attention to the fact that a well-trained, well-equipped network was at work. This is interesting. Ali Shamkhani, who's been on top of the key security matters for the regime, former minister of the regime, he's now senior advisor on military affairs to Rouhani. He's a spokesperson for the Supreme National Security Council. He said 2 days ago, I believe 34 MEK members have been arrested so far. A vast network of individuals operating not under MEK's name, but pursuing their line and modus operandi were also identified. To sum up, the main takeaways of the uprising is that basically what we saw during the uprising is that it was focused on the overthrow of the Iran regime. People felt this is the time to take things into their hands. They consider the regime in its entirety illegitimate, and they're ready to pay the price. You saw the level of bravery and the courage shown by the young people in the streets of 170 cities across the country, and showing the utter weakness of the regime, that change is really attainable. It's not just an idea, rather it can be done, and the regime was extremely fearful that that was what was happening on the ground. The second point is that the gains during these past few days, the uprising, are irreversible. No matter what level of repression the regime uses, it's not going to change anything. They did the same thing 2 years ago, thinking that they had been able to put down the revolt. What happened was that actually things got even deeper, and things moved up several levels. And if a page was turned in 2018, now we have a new chapter. Then the role of the organized opposition, the organized resistance is crucial, because that's what they have been vying for, that they have been calling for. They've been targeting the symbols of the regime over the past 2 years, and you can see how it paid off. Now, what should be done? Well, the international community has its part to do. They really need to hold the regime and their leaders accountable for the crimes that they have committed against humanity. More sanctions are needed. We identified a number of individuals and agencies of the regime involved. They need to be designated. Some of those entities are not designated as we speak. We have a track record of alerting about the entities that need to be designated, and in a lot of those cases, those actions have taken place after we alerted the international community about them. UN Security Council must hold the regime accountable for their crimes, and they need to stop the internet terrorism by the Iran regime. It's not acceptable that in the next round of protests that the regime would turn off the internet, to cut off the communications, to not allow the outside world the level of brutality the regime is doing. That needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. And I think all the countries in the world have a role to play. And they need to send an investigative delegation to assess the situation on the ground. But most importantly, they need to recognize the right of the people of Iran to overthrow the regime, as the developments over the past few days actually is a testament to that. With that, I'd like to end our presentation here, and happy to take your questions. If you have any, there's a microphone that they can turn it around. Please identify yourself and raise your question.
Hi, my name is Atsushi Takemoto with Kyodo News, Japanese
Yes.
news agency. Thank you for doing this.
So thank you for coming.
I have one question about your information gathering. Last week, the US Secretary of State Pompeo urged Iranian people to provide videos and photographs of the crackdown of the protest
Yes.
to the US, to extend the US sanction over Iranian officials. I'm just wondering, you have all these videos and photos and numbers and everything. Are you working with the US government in sharing this information? And also, another question is that Amnesty International is saying the death toll is roughly around 140, and you are now saying more than 450. Could you explain, I understand there's a technical difficulty, but could you explain?
Sure. Certainly the information that we have compiled, and we constantly update that, has been available to everybody in the international community, including has been available to the US government. But we have also made this public. In terms of the figures, if you notice, Amnesty International just updated their numbers to the figure that you just said, but they have said this is at least the numbers that they have been able to identify and confirm, which is actually close to the number of the individuals' names that we have confirmed their identities. However, due to the difficulties on the ground in terms of communications, and also identifying exactly the identity of the people who were killed, we have information that in such and such incident, 2 or 3 people, for instance, were killed, but we may not know the identity. That's why we said at least 450 people have been killed based on the information that we have carefully compiled, getting information from both our network inside the country, the MEK resistance units and the resistance councils, but also based on the regime's own figures that are publicly available, compiling and corroborating all of those. So I don't see any discrepancy. I think what the Amnesty International has done is further highlighted the need to what needs to be done. That the fact that they were able to confirm that many number of the killings, which is far greater, that's several times of the numbers they were able to confirm for the 2018 uprising, shows still, again, the seriousness of the situation and the fact that this needs to be continued. That's further the need for investigation, sending missions to Iran, And we need to really have a very comprehensive, a very aggressive investigation on the killings, because there was a reason for the regime to shut down the internet. And one of the main reasons was to basically hide these facts that we're trying to unveil. Thank you so much. Please, sir.
The question is only about these people in the streets. Do you know what they need exactly? Are they still looking for a better life, like gas, like food, like wages? Or do you know that, or you have information about their political revendication now? And also, do you know if they are represented till now politically? Like, who could be like the people who represents them or represent their revendication till now?
Thank you so much for your question. Well, the reality is over the past 40 years, especially the past 2-3 years, have made these issues inseparable. It's no longer valid to think that people are only looking for better life and improvement of the economic situations without pursuing a political purpose of overthrowing the regime, because they have learned one cannot be attained without the other. In other words, the people have tried everything. The regime has, but all the tricks of you can pursue the elections. We have moderates, we have, different factions, and they play so many different games. They made so many promises, and they try to play with the population with those promises. It was Khatami, and then now the past 6-7 years, Rouhani has been making those promises. And as the demonstrations 2 years ago showed, that people have put an end to it, saying, reformers, hardliners, the game is now over. And that's why, even though this may have been sparked by the rise in the gas prices at petroleum stations, but in reality, this was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. And people felt this is the time that they need to take things into their hands. So I wouldn't really separate these issues, the economic hardship that they're facing, and the fact that they are targeting those institutions, symbols of power of the regime and symbols of corruption by the Iran regime. They're inseparable. They have learned it with their flesh and blood, that improving their life is equivalent to overthrowing this regime in its entirety. And in terms of the leadership, you saw in the statements by the Iran regime officials that there was a coordinated effort, that no matter where you are, which city you are, the targets are the same. They don't target any civilian locations or anything like that. They're targeting the regime symbols of repression and economic power, no matter where you are, whether it's a capital or in Kurdistan and other places. The slogans are the same. That level of coordination shows a nation unified over what they really want. They want this regime overthrown in its entirety. It also shows that the role that the organized resistance, particularly the Mujahideen Khalq resistance units and resistance councils, had played. Because at the time that the regime was beguiling the people about the reform and everything, these resistance units were targeting the symbols of the regime, putting the pictures of Khamenei and others on fire, and showing the people that you only have one way ahead of you, and that's the overthrow of this regime. That's a strategy, that approach by the resistance units have paid off, both in terms of their efforts on the ground over the past, particularly the past 2 years, since the 2017-2018 uprising, but also during the protests as the regime's leaders are confessing.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I work for the Alliance for the Restoration of Cultural Heritage.
Yes.
Thank you for the briefing. This is a very first important step to hold the regime accountable, because you put all the names and everything. My question is, if the protests are successful or if they bring about change in Iran, what could be the positive domino effect in the region for other countries like Lebanon, Syria? Do you see any domino effect?
Great question. And it actually relates to what has been already happening in the region. We didn't really get to it, but one of the factors that further helped the people and hurt the regime was what was happening in Iraq and in Lebanon. These are the places that the regime claimed absolute authority over those places. You know, they always said that Iraq is in our pocket because of the 60% Shia population in Iraq. Iraq has the highest Shia population percentage in the world after Iran, and the common borders and the whole history and all of that. And they had developed, Shia militias and huge amount of influence there. Now the whole thing has turned against the Ayatollahs. The center of rebellion in Iraq is actually Karbala, which is one of the two holiest sites of the Shiites in the world. And the next one is Najaf, and then Basra and Baghdad and other places. So that's a clear indication that the policy of export of terror and Islamic fundamentalism by the Iran regime has largely failed in those states. The same situation in Lebanon, that Hezbollah dominated not just militarily down south, but also the political scene in Lebanon. And everyone knows Hezbollah is a brainchild of the Iran regime, fully funded, trained, and supported by the Iranian regime. And the population has stood up against those in power, predominantly the Hezbollah. So think about the change in Iran. When that change happens, and we're hoping that that will take sooner than later, the impact it would have in the whole region, instead of Iran being the epicenter of terror and instability and export of extremism that has affected very negatively the whole region, Iran could be the cradle of civility and democracy, human rights, coexistence, and as stipulated in the 10-point plan of Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, that those who want change in Iran, they want to develop their own country. They don't want to intervene in the affairs of other countries. They want peace with their neighbors. It's been enough for the war that Khomeini dubbed as the war of infidels against the world arrogance in 8 years of Iran-Iraq war, and what has happened in Syria and other places. It will put an end to all of that. I think with the free Iran, the whole face of Middle East will change, because Hezbollah will lose its main backer and main supporter, and soon they could be diminished. The impact of the influence of the Iran regime in Syria would be totally different, because once Hezbollah loses its influence there, they can't help Assad in Syria, and the direct help that the regime was making to Assad will be gone, and a whole new opportunity there. And the Iraqi people will have the chance to govern their own country, rather than being ruled by those the Shia militias and those corrupt politicians like Maliki and his successors, who only answer to Tehran and the Iran regime's demands. And everybody else in the region will have a totally different future. So think about that prospect, not just for the people of Iran, a free Iran, a democratic Iran, a non-nuclear republic form of government in Iran, but the impact that it will have in the whole region would be totally different, would be enormous. Thank you.
Courtney McBride with the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
You mentioned the international community and the role that it has
Yes.
to play. You talked about the need for additional sanctions. Do you think that would be effective, or are you concerned that, for instance, all of these banks or individuals affiliated with them would continue to evade sanctions? Do you think that those that exist now are effective but need to be augmented, or are they being evaded?
Certainly the sanctions are effective, but that's not the whole thing. Obviously, when those entities get designated, such as those banks, Already these sanctions that have been put on the Iran regime has created enormous problems for the Iran regime in terms of their dealings, their trade, their financial transactions. The regime has a tough time moving money around. The oil sanctions, for instance, has made it extremely difficult. Their oil export is way down to maybe 100, 200,000 barrels a day. That's not even comparable to what the regime needs is 2-3 million barrels a day, and what they can export through small tankers to Iraq and other places is not going to do the job for the Iran regime. So that's why these additional sanctions are always very helpful, both in terms of squeezing the regime, but also it has a very important political message. It sends a signal to the ruthless rulers of Iran that the world is watching them, that it takes away the legitimacy of those institutions. When they're not on a sanctions list as though they're kosher, okay? You want to take that away and send a signal to the regime, but also a signal to the people of Iran that we are going after your oppressors. We identify those oppressors and we designate them. Think about Jahromi, who is the Minister of Censorship of the Iran regime. We exposed him in February of 2018 in a press conference right here, showing how he, in collaboration with the IRGC intelligence organization, they had developed spyware-enabled apps under very benign-looking things that they even got their applications into Apple Store and Google Play and all of that. Those were instruments that if people downloaded them, would enable the regime to spy on them and to arrest a lot of those protesters. And we mentioned about some of those organizations, front organizations, that he was running or he had helped put together. Thank God those institutions were eventually sanctioned by the Treasury, and now most recently Jahromi himself, after benefiting the internet for himself and the regime and cutting off to the people, he was sanctioned by the Treasury Department. We need to get all of those instruments in hand. But as you said, that's like a necessary step, but not enough. The next step would really be to do something positive for the population. We mentioned the internet. Internet is really, really crucial. It's not boots on the ground, which people don't want, or appropriating money. This is just providing free access. This is just ending censorship. And it's crucial for the population, both for communicating among themselves, but also getting their information out, getting the truth out. Also, when making statements such as the people of Iran have the right to change the regime. This corroborates with the U.S. principles, the founding fathers of this country, but also sends a very strong signal to the regime that their days are numbered, and the fact that the people, the protesters, their voice is heard, and their efforts has gained support in various capitals around the world.
Thank you, first of all, for all the fantastic information you provided. My name is Sophie Saidi. I'm a professor of international relations, University of Baltimore. 2 years ago, there was a mass uprising in Iran in January, and all analysts believe that the extent, the rapidness, the organization, and just overall resistance of Iranians this time around was incomparable. Obviously points out, as you alluded, and in other questions and answers, that there is a leadership involved. Also, we know that Iran is increasingly becoming delegitimized in the region. You pointed out, and as we all know, there were protests, mass protests in October in Iraq, completely pointed out by the slogans and demands of Iraqi people to get rid of the influence of Iranian Pasdaran corps in Iraq, as well as we know that Hezbollah's complete influence by Iranian regime over the past decades. They were also losing legitimacy in Lebanon, which led to mass protests for people and change of government of Hariri. So given the scenario and context that Iran is situated, first, I mean, the question is, do you believe that there will be continuous mass protests in Iran? And also, do you believe that there will be a helpful kind of a gesture by the international community, or if it's needed, to recognize an alternative, considering that we need to be forward-looking in terms of the future of Iran and the democratic demands of the Iranians that are paying clearly, with all the statistics and the videos that you showed today, a heavy price to move towards democracy in that country, to declare an alternative to this theocracy that's ruling Iran, and would it be time now? And pretty much in support of the potential continuation of the Iranians' uprising in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your thorough explanation and your important question. Certainly, the protests, as I mentioned here, will certainly, the uprising will continue. As I said, the people have made up their mind, no matter how many people they arrest, how many people they kill, what level of repression they use, it will only make people more determined to bring down the Ayatollahs. Every single person they kill, every single of these videos that are seen by the Iranian public, even if they weren't there, just, plants this desire to bring down the Ayatollahs even sooner. So that the path forward is very clear, and the people are very determined in moving forward and preparing for the next round. And the resistance units are very, very determined. I know that for a fact, that they have been empowered throughout these protests. And of course, the role of international community is important, and that's why we're having this press conference here. There needs to be voices in support of those who are standing up, especially in this day and age, the age of communications. It's so important, the international community, to do their part. They need to realize that the days are numbered for this regime. Don't pin any hopes on the Ayatollahs. This is not the same regime that was in place even last year or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. This is a regime that is facing the beginning of its end. And for that matter, it's so crucial for the international community, for the United States particularly, to do its part, to build as much pressure on the Iran regime, but also looking towards the protesters. Recognizing the right to overthrow this regime is most crucial, most important. As it has happened in every other country. Remember Solidarity in Poland, in South Africa. When there was a nationwide resistance and move to end the cruelty and dictatorship, the world stood on their side in no uncertain terms. And the same situation must be present right now. I want to thank all of you for attending the press conference today, and we're available for if you have any other questions afterwards. Thank you very much.